religion is an art. It's the greatest art. It's an extension of the communion that all the other arts attempt. I sat down and I was crying because I just had enough. I felt like I was involved in some strange encounter that I didn't understand. And I looked up and I saw Christ's face in stained glass. And I spoke out loud and I said, if you're there, you have to help me.
Sally Reed, that's a very fitting name for an author, for a writer. Were you ever teased when you were at school for that name, or even in the writing industry?
No, no, it's a pretty common name where I'm from, and it actually means you've got red hair. It's like an Anglo-Saxon name, and it comes from having red
Oh, I
hair.
see.
Yeah.
I see. See. Okay. Night's Bright Darkness is the book that you wrote about your conversion story. I loved it. It resonated a lot with me just because I also am a convert to Catholicism. Um, your journey kind of reminds me of Sigrid Undset, the writer, the Norwegian writer. She grew up atheist. She had a great love for her father, and she always sought out the truth and loved the written word. And she even moved to Italy, just like you. Could you tell us a bit about your upbringing and how how your parents nurtured your desire for the truth and for poetry and the arts and the written word? Did your dad ever read to you T.S. Eliot or something like that? Yeah.
No, he didn't. But my parents both read to me like from the very beginning, and they read us children's stories and novels. So it was a very kind of literary household in that way. So books were always a big part of our lives, and but we were very much an atheist family. Like there was no religion in the house, and my dad really hated religion, and but he was kind of a moral man and was very keen to help people who were less fortunate. And I just had this kind of desire within me from an early age that I wanted to try and do something good. I don't know if I ever succeeded or if I've ever succeeded since then, but I wanted to help people, and so that was what led me into training to become a psychiatric nurse. And so, yeah, but it's interesting because I didn't really realize this, but my mother's father, my grandfather, he was from Northern Ireland, and I knew that he was from a very Protestant background, like very radical Protestant kind of orange men. And
Mm.
I just learned recently at a family funeral that like my great uncle Billy, I think, was actually a kind of a preacher. He would kind of preach in the highways and byways of Northern Ireland. So there's definitely religion going back in the family, but I wasn't exposed to any of it.
Okay. And working as a psychiatric nurse, that must have been a really great experience and a great insight into the suffering of human beings, into the human condition. And how did that experience shape your understanding of the world and your beliefs?
Yeah, it was a really interesting job, and I really loved my patients. It was so incredible. They were also incredibly interesting. Um, I nursed in North London, and so the demographic was quite particular. There were lots of Irish patients and lots of Jewish patients, and the people were just phenomenal. And it was difficult work because you were up against absolute sort of depression and difficulties with living life. So it was very difficult. In terms of how it shaped me, I think I was aware of the preciousness of life and how beautiful people could be in extraordinarily hard conditions. Um, and to me, it really emphasized the importance of story, like listening to patient stories about how they had left, Germany as children during the First World War and come to find a home in England. Those stories were very important to me, and I thought they were really kind of worth preserving. So I did write about some of them in a kind of fictionalized form for a book that I was writing.
In your book, you talked about a man who you would every day you would shave his face, and he at one point they stopped giving him food. I think is what you said, and at that moment when you had this patient with you, seeing him every day, and you said that you had like a glimpse. He seemed to be communicating with you through his eyes and tried as hard as he could, but he just couldn't say anything. What were you thinking at this point? How did that change anything about how you believed? Um, and did that change your atheistic views at all? Or yeah, could you explain that?
Yeah, no, it didn't. And I think, this was way back in the 1990s, and it seemed the world was less divided at that point. So these days,
Mm,
the debates about euthanasia and abortion and even vaccines, like everything's on a divide. You're either pro or you're against. And back when I was young, it wasn't like that. So it wasn't like I sort of, as I was nursing this man, I did feel like, oh my goodness, I think he's still there. I think that what if this is a mistake? What if they're kind of starving him to death and they shouldn't be doing that? It didn't seem to me like, oh, that means I have to leap over an ideological divide. You know,
mm,
it was just something that I was concerned about. And later, much later, when I converted, I thought back to it and I thought, that's interesting because I can see now that, it's not so good to withhold food from people.
mhm.
So yeah, things weren't so clear cut then, and my own kind of my moving towards God was not apparent to me until 2010, which is when my conversion really happened.
Hmm. And how did poetry come into your life? What made it so you talked a little bit about how your parents read you a lot of literature when you were children, but how particularly poetry, how did it inspire you to become a poet?
I think in my teens, I mean, like we read poetry, children's poetry when I was little, but I really got into Sylvia Plath and Yeats, and I think it's the usual kind of adolescent thing where you want to find something that expresses your anguish, and it was as simple as
Yeah.
that. And I began to write poetry for the same reason because I wanted to express what I was feeling. And then when I got into my 20s and I was nursing, then it became what I used to make sense of things and to make sense of relationships that I was in as well. And I became much more serious about it. And at
Mm,
that point, I was kind of imitating poets that I'd read, like Plath and like Yeats and like Keats. And so it wasn't my own voice. And it was actually a boyfriend
mm,
who kind of bought me contemporary poetry and said, look, you've got to actually pay attention to what's being written now. And I didn't like much of what was being written, but that's always the case with contemporary poetry because there's always a lot of awful stuff that's being written, but time will purge away that. So once I kind of looked deeply into what was being written, I did find contemporary poets that were really, really, really worthwhile. And then you begin to realize that when you're writing poetry, you are actually part of a big conversation, and you can't just think to yourself, well, I'm going to write like poets in the 19th century, because it doesn't work like that. It's an onward movement, and you have to be in the stream, but at the same time you have to be something truly original, and also have the weight of tradition in what you're doing. So it's a complex thing. So that's
mm.
a complicated answer to your question, but that's how the poetry kind of emerged.
Okay. I read as well that you put poetry kind of on a pedestal as like idolatry. It was your answer to everything. Why did you think that?
Well, I think because I didn't have any religion, poetry was what I used to make me feel better. And I used to say that, language was redemptive because language would give form to things and give us beauty in kind of ugly situations. So it was kind of idolatrous because I thought that it could save me. And I thought that if I wrote and if I became a poet, then that identity would kind of make me happy and it would be the answer to everything. And that's basically, I think, idolatry. So it wasn't a harmful addiction, but I think that that's what it was.
I was thinking you were living the feminist dream. And looking back at it now, how did the reality of living that kind of lifestyle, how can that compare to the ideal that is portrayed in society today? How they say that feminism is um, the way for women to be free.
Yeah, I didn't find it a very ideal situation, to be honest. And I realized quite soon as a young woman that there was all this pressure to date and to be free and to kind of have casual sex. And I always found it just a pressure and a difficulty. And I found that I was constantly having my heart broken. And I felt very lonely. Um, so I never saw it as a good thing. And again, I didn't articulate this at the time. It wasn't like I said, "Oh, I'm aware of the fact that I'm feeling that feminism is wrong in any way." But as I grew up, I realized that was why I'd been so lonely, was because as young people in England, we were all leaving home and going and living in shared housing or on our own, and nobody wanted to settle down. And that kind of life, it doesn't suit everybody. And I think a lot of women are kind of instinctively looking for a partner and wanting to be able to have children. And because of the way things are constructed in society nowadays, that most often doesn't happen till our 30s, which is really quite late. So
Mhm.
yeah, to me, the feminist dream in that sense has not been good. But I don't shy away from the word feminism, because feminism has lots of different meanings. And and I think that respecting women and campaigning against pornography and against contraception and abortion, because they do harm women, that's all, that to me, that's feminist. So it's a very, very broad term, and feminists don't all believe the same things. It's a very big
Mhm.
term.
Okay. And at what point in your life and your journey, so you were living this feminist lifestyle, what changed? What brought you to the so-called evil, misogynistic, sexist Catholic Church?
Well, it was a very, very dramatic and quick conversion in 2010, and I'd been becoming very disillusioned with poetry. I'd published 2 books, and I was feeling like there was something missing in what I was writing and in what I was reading in terms of contemporary poetry. And I wasn't, selling many books. That's a separate issue. I mean, poets don't sell many books, so that was just to be expected. Um, and I thought to myself, gosh, there must be something else that I could write that would be more fulfilling, and that I would have a bigger readership and perhaps even make some money. And so I decided with a friend of mine who's a doctor, we were going to write a book about female sexuality and reproduction, etc. And she was going to do the medical stuff, and I was going to do the psychological and social stuff. And during my research, I wanted to interview women of all different backgrounds about their sexuality. And so I tried to contact women of the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith and the Catholic faith as kind of representative, as well as atheist women and and gay women and all the rest of it. And I could find gay women and secular women very easily, but I couldn't find anybody of faith to speak to me at all. And I didn't know what to do about this. And so I eventually contacted this priest who was living in our town, who was a Byzantine Rite priest, who had fled Ukraine because he'd been cleaning up corruption in the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And he'd actually nearly been killed because of that. So I wrote to him to ask him if he'd help me. And we began this kind of discussion about the Catholic faith. And it got quite heated. And I really did hate the church, because it was when all the abuse stories were coming out. And that was when I had these incredible experiences, which began in April, and there were 3. And I didn't realize until much later that it was actually the Trinity that was kind of coming to me. I didn't realize, for months actually. Um, did you want me to go into the whole conversion story, or?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Go ahead. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So the first experience was, I was very upset by the arguments with this priest and not really knowing what was going on. And I wasn't writing; I was blocked, because I was writing a poetry book, and I was also writing this nonfiction book, and I wasn't doing any work. And I began to read this book that I read regularly, called "I Capture the Castle," which is by Dodie Smith, and it's a very entertaining novel. I actually think it's brilliant, but it's, in essence, it's for young women, kind of old-fashioned YA, if you like. And so I was rereading this novel, and in it, the protagonist is very upset, and she's brokenhearted, and she's walking to see the vicar, because she wants to borrow a record from him, because the music will remind her of this man that she loves. So she goes to see the vicar, and he knows all about the situation, but she doesn't realize that. And he's trying to really gently make her see that religion would help her. And I'd read this scene ever so many times in my life, and then when I got to this particular line, which I'd read, dozens of times, the line is, "Religion is an art. It's the greatest art. It's an extension of the communion that all the other arts attempt." And when I read those words, I put the book down, and it was just like, oh my goodness. And suddenly I could see that potentially there was a God, there was a creator, and that all of my energy and my obsessing to write poetry and to kind of succeed in being a poet was actually exactly that. It was an extension. I wanted to reach out and to the greatest creator, and that there was, the poem had already been written. Like God already sees everything that's poetic and all the connections between things in poems. And I thought, my goodness, if this creator exists, then he not only he created me, so he knows me. He might even love me. It was. I could see that this would be an enormous thing, and that it would mean enormous joy in my life. But I didn't see how I could know who this God was, or how it could be a benign God because of the suffering in the world. So I
Mhm.
contacted the priest and I kind of told him what had happened to me, because it was a kind of an epiphany. And I said, so which God would I go to? Would it be the Hindu God? Would it be the Muslim God? Or, what would I do? And he didn't say anything. He just said, only Christ can convert you. But that was all he said. And and then we met for coffee to kind of talk about religion and suffering, um, and then about 10 days after that, I was feeling even more churned up, even more blocked, and kind of just very, very confused. And I couldn't sleep. I mean, the whole thing through this period was that I could not sleep at all. It was appalling. And one night when I was not sleeping, I came downstairs and had a little shot of whiskey and read some T.S. Eliot. And then when I went back to bed, I actually lay down on the floor beside my daughter's bed because she wasn't very well. And as I lay down, I had something that was a very dramatic kind of supernatural experience. And I don't say that lightly, because you know, it's just that with it, I'm a nurse for a start, so I'm used to kind of psychosis. I'm used to knowing what constitutes mental illness. Um, and I'd had the whiskey, but it was a very, very small shot, and I'm not on drugs, just to say that. But as I lay down on the floor, I felt this kind of warmth just kind of permeate my body and kind of roll through me, and the tears just like flooded my face, and I just felt completely softened. It was like I'd been kind of twisted and kind of rigid and kind of arguing, and suddenly I felt like, oh my goodness, I don't have to argue. I don't have to argue. And I just had this image of myself as kind of a candle, or the heart of a candle flame, like I was softened. And what's really interesting is, literally about 2 weeks ago, I read a quote by St. John Vianney, and he talked
Mm,
about the believer being like a candle that's softened by the
yeah.
flame. Yeah, did you know? I didn't even know that. So
Mhm.
so strange. Anyway, um, again, I wrote to the priest the next day and I tried to explain what had happened. And it was very difficult to find the vocabulary, because as I've spoken to you now, I'm using lots of metaphors, and it was like this, it was like that. But it's a very difficult thing to describe. I knew that something had happened, and it was something external that had come into me. Um, and he just sent me a copy of St. John of the Cross's Dark Night, the poem. And then at the bottom, he just wrote, next week is Pentecost. And I didn't know what Pentecost was. So I was no more reassured and no more happy, really. And about kind of another few weeks after that, perhaps a couple of weeks, it was by this time in May, um, I went to pick up my daughter from nursery school, and near her school there's a little church. And because I was early, I went into the church just to sit down and kind of gather my thoughts. And I sat down and I was crying, because I just had enough. I felt like I was involved in some strange encounter that I didn't understand. I realized that there was something supernatural going on, but I just didn't know what it was. I didn't know what to do. And I looked up and I saw Christ's face in stained glass. And I spoke out loud and I said, if you're there, you have to help me. And as I said it, I felt this presence come towards me and almost physically lift me. It was a very particular sensation, and it was like I'd got amnesia, and someone walked into the room that gave the whole of my life back to me. It was this absolute relief and this absolute love and this absolute mercy. And my tears dried instantly on my face. I felt such incredible joy. And when I left the church, I was Christian. There was no going back. That was the biggest turning point. It was absolutely amazing. And when I got home, I prayed the Our Father, and I continued to pray every single day. And then I had to decide which denomination I would belong to. And of course, I didn't want to be a Catholic, but I realized that the only place I could get close to that presence again was in Catholic churches, because I soon came to realize the Eucharist was there, and I just was desperate to receive the Eucharist. So once I'd done
Mm.
lots and lots of reading, And thinking through the summer, I knew that I had to become Catholic. In the December, I was received in the Vatican. So it was a 9-month journey.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I relate because it was my husband. My husband grew up atheist. He's French, and they're basically 90% of the population's atheists. And then one day he came up to me and said, "Oh, you should, I'm starting to read the Gospels, and I think God exists."
Wow.
And then I thought, okay, well, then which church do you think of going to? Like, which religion? Is it Buddhist, or, just like anything but Catholic? And he said, oh, Catholicism. I was like, no, anything, please, anything but Catholicism. Because I also had that I misunderstood Catholicism. I didn't really grow up with it. I'm Filipino, but my parents are Mormon, and then it was through my husband that I became atheist. And so it was one of those religions. It was the religion I didn't want to be a part of. But I remember being an atheist when I first moved to France. Whenever I would go to churches, it was one of my favorite things to do, just to go to a church and sit down. And for some reason, just like you, something would happen. I would feel this softening. I couldn't explain what it was, but I had this great desire to always visit a church whenever I would go for my walk or on different trips. And so, yeah, no, I definitely understand um, that experience of God just coming to you all of a sudden at you, and you can't explain it, but something in you changes. Um, in your book, you talked about how you struggled in the beginning to pray. So now you do pray the Our Father every day. How did you overcome that? And what advice would you give to someone who's struggling or who doesn't know how? Because I remember that as well, going back into prayer. It was very bizarre.
Well,
Yeah,
I
what's
don't
your
recall struggling actually. I don't know which bit of the book that will be. I don't recall that. I remember that I was very clear from the beginning that prayer was just like sitting with a presence. It was just knowing that God was looking at you. Maybe I've forgotten
Oh,
something I
yeah.
said. I don't know. But
I thought you had mentioned that you didn't know how, and
well,
you didn't
I
know
guess I was thinking,
you couldn't.
it was like, well, which prayer do I pray? But I quickly thought, well, the Our Father, like that's what it must be.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But in terms of like prayer, it was just to me it was very much being in his presence. And so to me it was kind of easy to begin with, and especially in adoration, like I would really feel God's presence very, very, very strongly. I would say probably I have more problems now than I did then. I think that because I'm in a routine, and I've been a Catholic now for almost 15 years. I think that sometimes I'm praying and I'm thinking, oh gosh, I'm just getting distracted. I'm not concentrating, and I think that that's a big part of it. But I'm praying much more now than I used to. There's much more prayer factored
Mhm.
into my life. So like daily prayer, at least once a day. So in a sense, I guess it's slightly inevitable that my mind would wander. Um, but I think that what I do in those circumstances is to go to the Jesus prayer. To me, the Jesus prayer is a really good way of just connecting, and just it's not at all taxing, and just repeating over and over and over again. And that seems to really work. It really works on the heart. But it is the prayer of the
Mhm.
heart. So that's what I would do.
And what to you was the hardest part about becoming Catholic?
Um, the hardest part was really that it seemed to create this rupture between, my old self and my new self, my old writing and my new writing, old friends and new friends. And that's not entirely the case, because lots of friends straddle that divide. And in fact, my best friend became Catholic 5 years after me, which was really wonderful. But that is a kind of an issue. And I feel like, cradle Catholics have this, they have the religion all the way through their lives. But with me, I've seen both sides, to such a degree that I can always understand the other side, even if I don't agree with it. And I'm still very, very fond of friends who are not at all religious. And I think some people view me with some suspicion because I'm religious. It's a strange thing. So I'd say that that's the
Mhm.
hardest thing about it.
Before we get into 100 great Catholic poems, I just wanted to ask, who is the Blessed Mother to you, and how did she lead you into a deeper love for Christ?
Well, I mean, she's been incredibly important. In fact, the book I published most recently is called The Mary Pages, and it's about Mary's role in my life and conversion. And that's the strange thing, is that the only person in my family that I knew that was religious was my grandmother, my father's mother. And she wasn't allowed to talk to me about religion. She was an Anglican. And on her wall, she had a couple of pictures of the Virgin Mary, a Raphael and a Lippi. And those pictures really kind of represent my childhood to me. You know, there was something that they imprinted on my mind and heart very easily. And when my grandmother died, I took possession of the pictures. My granddad gave them to me. And then it was weird because in my 20s, I became really obsessed with Marian art, and I was collecting Marian art all the time. And I always had a picture of Mary in my room. And I thought that I just liked Renaissance art, you know. And then I had a new age kind of phase, and thought it must be a kind of a goddess thing that I was into. But it was just really odd. But she was very, very quiet, but she was always there. And then when I actually converted, it was like she took a step out of the picture, and I wasn't aware of her at all. You know, it wasn't like I suddenly had a Marian devotion. I really didn't. It was all about Jesus. And it took, you know, the last few years for me to really understand that Mary's been working in my life all the time, all the time. You know, I've known her since I was tiny. And so now, like, I mean, I prayed the rosary every day for quite a long time, but it's kind of become very, very important to me in the last few years. And, you know, to me, she's this kind of, she's not, you know, not just a woman, she's kind of a place that I go to. She pulls me closer to Christ. She's kind of got my back all the time. And she's an amazing intercessor.
Yeah, I urge all the listeners to read Night's Bright Darkness, because it's beautifully written, and it goes into more detail about Sally's life, and I think you would benefit from it. So 100 great Catholic poems. Why do you think this collection, poetry, is especially needed today?
Well, just generally in a secular society, poetry has kind of become the most, I think, the art form with the most difficulties, because poetry requires of us our time and our concentration and our stillness. And we just don't have that anymore. You know, our attention spans have shrunk because of social media. And so it's countercultural in the extreme. And I think that if people would slow down and actually take time to read poetry, it would help their minds, it would help their souls, and it would help them to, you know, develop a kind of an appreciation, and it would even help them in their kind of intellect, because I think that we're neglecting our intellect a lot.
Yeah.
But also that poetry is incredibly consoling, and it reaches far, far deeper than the kind of other more, you know, trite art forms like kind of light verse or Instagram reels or whatever it might be. Like, it goes far, far deeper
Mm-hmm.
within us. And as Catholics, I mean, poetry is the language of God. You know, it's of all the art forms that there are, God chose the spoken word, the written word rather, to reach us, which is, you know, the Bible. And poetry within the Bible, there is a lot of it. So it really is the language of God. And the Catholic Church is built on poetry, because we use the Psalms all the time. Many of our prayers are poems. We use the language of poetry in the Mass, you know, the symbols of the dove as the Holy Spirit, and the different colours meaning different things. So it's a very, very poetic religion. And so poetry can only help us in our understanding. In fact, Thomas Merton said that if you can't understand poetry, then you can't understand Scripture. And he used to teach poetry in his classes at the seminary of Our Lady of Gethsemane.
For choosing, what was the process for choosing the 100 poems? What were the criteria, and was it difficult to only choose 100?
I wouldn't go so far as to say it was difficult to choose 100. I mean, there are more. There are definitely more. But I think that some poems just leapt out at me, like, for instance, the Divine Comedy by Dante. I knew that had to come into it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Gerard Manley Hopkins had to come into it. So there are various people who had to be included. And then it was just a real delight to go back in time and actually pull out people who've been forgotten, who shouldn't have been forgotten. Because there's so much Catholic literature that has been just kind of lost, like sort of
Mm-hmm.
8th, 9th, 10th century works by Irish poets and by some of
Mm.
the saints. And then even in the 20th century, there's a poet called F.T. Prince, who was very celebrated at the time, but has kind of been just glossed over because he was religious and because he wrote in form. So it was a real journey of discovery, and it was really fun to do and just really delightful. So
Mm.
yeah, it wasn't difficult to find 100. I think some poets I wanted to repeat. So Jeremiah Hopkins, there are actually 3 of his poems in the book, but on the whole, there are only one. There's only one poem per poet.
And were there any poets that you really wanted to add to the collection, but they didn't make the cut? And who were they?
Yeah, yes, actually, Siegfried Sassoon, the First World War poet, who was a wonderful poet in his earlier years when he wasn't a believer. He wrote really amazing poems, and then he converted, and his poetry really went off, which is very, very sad. And who knows why? That lots of reasons. I mean, poets often have a kind of an arc in their writing where they do kind of lose it towards the end. So I kept
Mm.
looking at his work, thinking, is there any way that I could put in a pre-conversion poem? But there wasn't one that was kind of religious enough. The other person was Claude McKay, who I did put in one of his poems, but that was difficult for the same reason. His pre-conversion poetry was much stronger than his post-conversion poetry, and again for various reasons. But I was lucky because he wrote a poem before his conversion and he rewrote it after his conversion, and it's very, very good. So yeah, that was good.
And how is your approach, because you yourself are a poet, how has your approach to writing changed since being exposed to all these? I remember reading in your book that you didn't know so many of these poets beforehand, and how has it changed when you write a poem now that you believe in God, or even in prose when you write your prose?
Well, I'm less frantic than I used to be in my writing. I think it's less kind of like my life depends on it. Um, and I'm just more trusting because I realize that when I do write something, it really if it's any good, then it's from God. Like He really does help me, and so therefore I have to just kind of relax and just think, well, if I'm going to write poetry, then I will, and if I don't, then I don't, and it's not really up to me. All I can do is lay the ground. All I can do is read and keep be disciplined in keeping notes and stuff. But it really is up to God if I write at all. So it's changed me in that way. I think I'm a bit more relaxed about it.
And several of the poems you translated yourself. How did you tackle the issue of, like the Italians say, traduttore, traditore, like the translator, trader?
Yeah.
How did you overcome that?
Yeah, that's always difficult, isn't it? I guess because let me think. I did Vittoria Colonna. I found it relatively easy, which perhaps I don't know if that's a good thing or not. What I do is because I speak Italian, obviously, so I looked at the
Yeah.
original and then I looked at several other versions and thought to myself, okay, well, how do I want to go with this? And then I think it's really important when you're translating that you don't get bogged down in being absolutely faithful to every single word in the same order because you can't in a poem. You have to literally completely
Mm.
rewrite it. But I thought it was pretty faithful, actually. I thought it was faithful. Um, and then the other one was Done is the Battle, which was from Old Scottish. So that took quite a lot of research. But again, that was fairly simple. In terms of meaning, it was simple. I had
Mhm.
to kind of get the rhythm. But yeah, it's an interesting process.
Okay. Um, so on to reading poetry. So a lot of people are very intimidated about reading poetry. They don't understand it. They don't know how to go about it. Um, how should they go about it? What are some things that they can do? Are there any poems that you could suggest from this book that they could start with?
Well, the good thing about the anthology is that every single poem has a commentary with it. So I made an effort to really set up the poem so that a reader could access it very easily by knowing something about the story of the poem, how it came to be written, something about the poet, something about the historical context, and then actually take the reader a bit through the poem as well. So that should ease the burden for a lot of people. Um, if you're really intimidated with poems, start with a short one. Don't go for a long one. I would say. Um, I wouldn't start with Jared Manley Hopkins because he's wonderful, but I think he'd be the wrong person to
Yeah.
start with because he is so rich. I would
Yeah.
start with there's a wonderful poem called Mass at Dawn by Roy Campbell, and that's short and very clear and really, really wonderful. And I would also look at Thomas Merton, and then looking further back, there's a wonderful translation of a Michelangelo sonnet that's very easy to understand, and it's really, really wonderful. But there are plenty of simple poems in there to begin with.
I really liked the Irish one, the Pangerban, uh, the one about the cat, and at the very end there was one by, I think he was a Polish poet. I forgot his name, but it's called The Confession,
Yeah,
where he
yeah. Czeslaw
goes through.
Milosz.
I
Yeah,
really, yeah, I really love that one. It's so simple, and it just got me the first time I read it. And I wanted to tell everybody that the way Sally Reed has written the introductions is not like a typical textbook introduction, and that's why I really appreciate it. Really does get um, into the heart of the poem in a way that is accessible and that you will be able to read it. Are there any contemporary Catholic poets that you think deserve more recognition that we should know about?
yeah. I try to, in a sense, it sounds ironic having talked about the anthology, but I try to avoid labeling people as Catholic poets in a way, especially contemporary poets. But there's a poet in England called Maria Apicella, and she's a convert, and her book is called Psalmody, and it's really wonderful. It's about relationship, and she's in the book she's a religious person, and her boyfriend is an atheist, and it's a collection of poems charting their relationship, and it's really, really beautiful. Um, and there's also a poet called Father Paul Murray, who's a Dominican friar in Rome, and his poetry is just incredibly lovely and amazing to read as part of your spiritual life. He's got a book out with Word on Fire called Light at the Torn Horizon, um, and another book which is in the voice of an Irish monk called Muling. And honestly, if you get those books, they are so insightful about spirituality and about life and love and woundedness and all of those things. So yeah, I would say look up Paul Murray and look up Maria Apicella, and there are many, many more. James Matthew Wilson's a wonderful poet, and gosh, I mean, there are lots.
How would you go about, let's say someone wants to try to write poetry, how could they start? Is there anything that they should read first? Yeah.
Well, the most important thing for any kind of writing is to read poetry, and so you should read widely, and especially read once you've read, the greats and the older poets. You should definitely read contemporary poetry because, as I said before, it's a living stream, and you can't divorce yourself from the stream. So the important thing is to read, and then also to remember that when you write, it's not as simple as writing about what you feel or even what you think you want to write. It's about using all of your senses and actually writing about the world around you, and the world around you reflecting your inner state. So it's a mind shift that people often don't understand or appreciate, and yeah, it's a kind of it's not easy, but it's a kind of a discipline. It's a way of looking at the world.
Are there any communities that aspiring writers for of poetry can join?
Well, I think that Word on Fire might have a community actually. I believe. And apart from that, when you're in France, I'm in Italy. Everyone is so far flung. I mean, I do give online tuition to aspiring poets, so I don't do groups, but I do kind of individual. I feel like there's a community. They don't know each other, but I've got my own community, and
Okay.
and that's really interesting for me. Like really interesting because you can really see how people develop, and there are lots of people who want to write poetry with a spiritual kind of basis.
All right. Um, just a few questions from some of the people in the group that I have. Someone said, Rachel said, I'd be interested to know what she thinks are the top 3 to 5 poems from the collection that would be good to recommend to people who don't like poetry or don't think they get it?
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, I think Mass at Dawn by Roy Campbell. I would say Donal Og by Anonymous, which is the 8th century Irish poem. And that's beautiful. It's a love poem and it's really, really gorgeous. So those two. And the final one, I would probably say, oh, there's one by Anne Porter towards the end. I'm just trying to think actually of the title. Yeah, I would say her because that's also very, very relatable and very accessible, I would say. Oh, and also A Confession, the one that you mentioned, right? Oh, there are so many, like One Flesh by Elizabeth Jennings. That's also really good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And another one from Ron. My question would be on her take on which poems have the most impact, the joyful poems or the sorrowful poems. Does she believe a poem about the Beatitudes or the Garden of Gethsemane would have the same effect, or does she have a preference when it comes to Catholic poems?
Right. So is he saying that should poems be happy or sad?
I think he's just asking your preference
Okay, my preference. Well,
of which ones speak to you most. I assume that's what he
um,
means.
well, as a poet, I've got a melancholic disposition, so I do like sad poetry. To admit.
I think that all artists are the same. Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
Mhm.
I have written a poem about the Garden of Gethsemane, and I haven't written a poem about the Beatitudes. So perhaps that says it all. Yeah, yeah. I would say I think that poetry, because it takes a long, hard look at life, it's never straightforwardly happy, or rarely so.
Mm,
You know.
okay. Is there anything else that you would like people to know about the book? Anything that we should take away from 100 Great Catholic Poems, or even Night's Bright Darkness?
Well, I would say in terms of poetry that it's a very good book to keep with you and to kind of read in conjunction with your prayer life. I mean, the poems were chosen very specifically to be. They're not all specifically devotional, but none of them are out of place in your spiritual life, I would say. So it's
Hmm.
not a bad thing during Lent or during Advent to kind of read a poem a day and to read the commentary. I think that'd be quite a good thing to do. And Night's Bright Darkness, I just hope that people enjoy it. I mean, I wasn't sure whether to read the book, to write the book, but people do seem to have found it very useful. So I think it's encouraging because it shows God's kind of presence in the world, you know. And I would also plug the Mary pages, which kind of is the sequel to Night's Bright Darkness.
Okay, great, great. No, I really enjoyed Night's Bright Darkness, and I'm sure everybody else would too. 100 Great Catholic Poems is so it's been part of it's one of those books I cannot I don't I can't read it at night because I will just keep reading it.
Ah, that's really
So
nice.
it's a good problem to have. So I really hope everybody else enjoys it.
It's a
Yes,
beautiful gift. I mean, it's a beautiful book, isn't it? They've done such a good job
yeah,
with the cover. It's so
yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Where can we find you? So for your books
Okay,
and your
so
poetry.
I've got a website called www.sallyreed.net. So it's Sally Reed, READ, obviously. So sallyreed.net, and there are links to all of my books there.